There has never been a better time to get into NeoVim. The impending release of NeoVim version 0.12 includes its own built-in plugin manager and a lot of other improvements. In this video, I'm going to be walking you through the latest version of NeoVim into your own custom configuration, which is going to be minimal, tastefully minimal, but powerful at the same time. You're going to have language server protocol support, linting, formatting, completion, your own beautiful status line. Now, there's a twist. We're going to do this with just 10 plugins. You can add more later if you want, but I want to keep this ultra minimal, ultra maintainable, and ultra powerful. In the age of AI slop, this flies in the face of agentic code editors and AI generated code. But I want to make a point about that. There's never been a better time to learn NeoVim because the foundational thesis of NeoVim is about editing code. We can generate code faster than ever before, but what we're going to be doing with NeoVim is improving our efficiency around motions, around macros, editing, moving around the code base. And that's never been more important than in 2026. So with that said, let's get into it. All right, team, so we need to install NeoVim. Right now I'm on the NeoVim roadmap. And if you have a look here, you'll see that the current stable release is 0.11, and it was a great release. But the one that I'm actually concerned with is imminent, and it is 0.12, the year of NeoVim out of the box. So the important thing here with the NeoVim out of the box 0.12, the most important improvement anyway, has been the addition of a plugin manager, vim.pack, and we're going to be using this plugin manager to install our plugins. There are other UI improvements and workflow improvements, and there's also the addition of the restart command, for example, that allows you to restart your NeoVim configuration. I'm going to link everything, of course, in the video description. But if we go to NeoVim releases, so this is GitHub, NeoVim releases, we can see that there is this NVim development pre-release build. Now it is very mature at this stage. Like I said, it's imminent release. And so we want to install 0.12. It's just important for this tutorial that you've got 0.12. Just check with your package manager. By the time you're watching this, it might already be released. Otherwise, you can follow the instructions here, which I'll link. You've got Windows, Mac OS, Linux, and this is a general Linux app image. Now, in my case, I'm actually on Arch. So go ahead and choose your installation approach. So I'm actually going to install it with Pacman. So I'm on KCOS, which is a flavor of Arch. And I'm going to install not NeoVim, but NeoVim Git. So here you'll see that it's saying, do you want to install the NeoVim Git 0.12? It doesn't too much matter what the patch version. It's important that you're just on 1.2. So let's proceed with the installation. Okay, so once it's installed, the first thing that we need to go is go to the entry point. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the entry point, all it is, this is just where NeoVim, when it starts, knows to look for its configuration. So what we can do, we can say mkdir, and I'm going to say -p for the path. We're going to put this into our config, and then here nvim. Now I already had a directory nvim, but in case you didn't, that would have created the directory. So now what we can do, we can actually cd into .config and NeoVim. And in here, I'm going to create a new init.lua. So we're going to say touch init.lua. Okay, so now we've created the init.lua file. And if we have a look in here, I've got this in Git just so that all these changes and everything is tracked, and you can also look up the Git link so you can see all of the different options and the configuration that we're going to build in this video. I've got an init.lua, and I've also got a readme just so that we can refer back to that. Now the init.lua at the moment is going to be empty. So what I'm going to do first of all is I'm going to say nvim, and we're just going to open nvim, and in here we can just confirm the version that we've got, and we can see that we've got 0.12. So now we can edit that init.lua file. Now, of course, right now it's empty. Now, remember that I said we've only got 10 plugins to play with. And one of the first things that people will do to make their NeoVim configuration look good is to give it a color scheme. But actually NeoVim has built-in color schemes. Some of my favorites are Unokai and Habermax. So we can actually look at these with the command, and then we can say color in the American spelling color scheme, and then in here we can say Habermax, for example. All right, and if I wrote in here, say local test function, and then just say end, well, you can see that we've got a certain kind of color scheme. Okay, so in my case, I like the Habermax color scheme, so I'm going to set it to color scheme Habermax. I'm also going to use term GUI colors just so we get the full color support. Okay, the next thing is NeoVim might be called out of the box in terms of the next release, but it's already got tons of stuff built in. All of this stuff predates NeoVim 0.12, but we're going to set some options here, and I've put a description against each of them just to make it a little bit clearer. Of course, though, we can use the help, the built-in help from NeoVim. I'll demonstrate that in a moment, but I'm just going to walk you through these basic options that I'm going to set. Okay, for example, right now on the left-hand side, we don't have any numbers, no line numbers, so we don't really know where we are. We also don't know where we are relative to other line numbers. We don't highlight the current line, although we do have a cursor, but the whole line is not highlighted. And by default, we're going to not wrap the line. So for example, if you're working on a large code base, maybe you've got a few panes open, I find it very annoying that the code wraps. And so by default, I'm not going to have it wrap, although we're going to look at some edge cases later with text where we do want it to wrap. Scroll off means that if you get within 10 lines at the bottom or 10 lines at the top, then we're going to keep the cursor 10 lines away from the top or the bottom, but keep scrolling up or down. And the side scroll off is going to be the same, 10 columns to the left or to the right. Now, this stuff is about the tabs. Now, my preference is to have the tabs are going to be actually 2 spaces, and all of these are actually just to achieve that. Now, if you want, you can have a look here. This is probably a good time to have a look at the help, and we can, for example, look at tab stop, and in here it's going to give us some better description. So for example, tab stop, or TS for short, in here it's going to define the column multiple used to display the horizontal tab character. Okay, so in my case, I just want it to be two horizontal tab characters. Okay, so if any of these are kind of unclear, go ahead and have a look at the help. Shift width, so obviously that pertains to the shift width. So tab is going to be 2 horizontal spaces, shift is going to be 2, and then we're going to have a soft tab. That's just where maybe you have like a lot of empty white space, and hitting backspace or tab is going to be 2 spaces there. And we want to expand using spaces instead of tabs. We want that smart auto indentation, which inherits from the surrounding context, and we want it to indent from the current line. Next part is around search. So we've got ignore case. So by default, if I search for something, say if I said case insensitive, okay, then it's found that. But if I now use case insensitive with a capital, which is the smart case, which is the next one, then it's going to become sensitive to the case. So by default, you can just search for everything in lowercase, and that's going to grab all uppercase. But if you start using uppercase, then it's going to be narrower. I also want to highlight my matches on search. So if I said, for example, / and I said vim.opt, now you can see all of the matches are highlighted, and I want it to be incremental. So we just saw as inc search, we see that it highlights as it increments. On the left-hand side, you're going to see a sign column, and then at 100 characters across, I want there to be just a subtle line just to indicate that this is 100. You could put it at 80 or 120. Everyone's got their own preference. And in a moment, we're going to save this, and all of this is going to become a lot more interesting because all of these options that I'm describing here are going to be applied. Okay, and we're going to show the matching brackets. we're going to have a single line command height. We've got some completion options here. So for example, when we tab and what options are going to be shown in the completion. We don't want to show the mode because we're actually going to build our own custom status line. And then we've got a few items here around the pop-up menu in terms of its height when the completion comes up, and as well as its transparency and that kind of thing. Okay, and then here we've just got some behavior around the performance and also hiding of characters. For example, I want this tilde not to show up on the left-hand side, and I want to set a few performance parameters here, including the conceal cursor. The next thing is when we go into a file, we want to have an undo directory, and we want that to persist. So not just when you go to the file and then you leave that file, but later when we come back to a file and we want to undo something that we did earlier, we want to save that into the undo directory or the undo dir. And so the first thing that we need to do to make sure that this works is we need to create an undo directory, and I'm just going to put that in .vim undo dir. You can put it wherever you want. In my case, I think that's totally fine. And so what this does is it just goes and it creates it if it doesn't already exist. Now, I'm only going to have undo. I'm not going to have backup. I'm not going to have any swap files, but I am going to have the undo file. I'm going to stipulate where that directory that I want to save those undos to is. And then I've got a few items here about completion, timeout, and auto read is important because let's say we have another process somewhere and that is manipulating the file that you're working on. What's going to happen is that it's going to auto reload if changes have been imposed on that file, or that file has been manipulated by another process outside of NeoVim. And I don't want to have autosave because I'm going to have format on save. We're going to get into that later when we get to the LSP section. Okay, so we're going to allow hidden buffers. We're going to have no error bells because it's annoying when there's sound coming from the computer, frankly. We're going to have better backspace behavior. So this is kind of in that same line as the tabs. It could even be in that section. I don't want it to automatically change the directory. If I'm working from a certain directory, I want that to be the base of where I am working from. And then I'm going to also append the dash to words. So for example, if this had a dash in it, this would all be one word. So if I hit W right now, it's taking me there. But once we apply these settings, that's all going to become one word. And here's some search items. So I'm going to include subdirectories in a manual search. Selection, I want it to be inclusive. So for example, if I go into visual mode and then I'm going to select this, I want that to be inclusive. I want it to grab everything up until where my cursor is. If it was exclusive, it wouldn't include that last double quote character. And so I'd have to do that in order to select it all. I'm going to use the mouse support, not often. Of course, that kind of flies in the face of what NeoVim is for, but sometimes it's handy just to adjust certain panes and that kind of thing. And I'm going to make sure that I append to the clipboard. Finally, we're going to allow for buffer modifications, and we're going to set the encoding to UTF-8. Now, it's been a while since I created this GUI cursor setting, but what it does is it makes it always be a block, and it makes sure that it blinks. I like it to blink to give me feedback that my system's still up. All right, and just wrapping up with the options, we're gonna have fold method. So you can use folds in NeoVim, and I'm going to actually use Treesitter, and we're gonna install Treesitter later, including with the new updated API. Okay, when we split, say we horizontally split, we want the new pane to be on the bottom, and when we split vertically, we want the new pane to be on the right. And I've got a few completion options down here, including some performance parameters. All right, so everything's done, and as I mentioned, we've got a new option. We can hit restart in NeoVim, and now I'm going to edit the init.lua, and immediately you can see that we've got our color scheme has been applied. And also we've got all these nice lines. We've got this column over here telling us that that's 100 characters. We have the line that we're on has been highlighted, and we know that we're on line 7. And we've got relative line numbers. And of course, there's a lot more stuff that we set here, and that wouldn't be immediately apparent. but these are kind of the foundational settings for our project. All right, so the next thing I want to do is I want to create a custom status line. So like I mentioned, we've already used that built-in custom color scheme, and we don't want to use too many plugins. So I'm going to actually create my own status line. At the moment, it's looking pretty basic down the bottom here. And so I'm going to create one which includes support for Git. That's the first thing here, which we're doing is we're going to go and get the Git branch, and we're going to find out what the icon is. Right, and so we're going to include our Git status in our status line, which we're building ourselves. And then the next thing we're going to do, I want to know which kind of file I'm in. And what I've done is I've tried to go away and I've got all of these different files. So for example, we've got the Lua icon, Python, JavaScript, TypeScript, CSS, Markdown, Vim, Bash, Rust, Go, and so on. I've tried to get as many as I can here because I don't want to introduce more dependencies. I want to have a minimal configuration that's highly maintainable. Then we've got a default one down here. But what we do is this is a function. It looks up the file type from the Vim API, and then based on that, it looks into this table and it says, okay, give us the file type. Okay, we're also going to look at the file size. So in a moment, we're going to use all these functions, and we're going to get the file size, and we're going to get some basic formatting. Is it megabytes? Is it kilobytes? How big is this file that we're in? And then before in the options, we actually disabled the mode because I want to have my own custom mode, and I've got some nice icons once again to go with that. All right, and so what we're going to do, we're going to say append this. If you ever see this underscore capital G, that just means that this is a global variable, and we're going to be applying the mode icon, the Git branch, the file type, and the file size. And so this finally down the bottom is our function that applies all this. So for example, we're going to call it setup dynamic status line. When we enter the window, when we enter a buffer, it's going to call this, and this is an auto command, and that's going to call all of our different functions. So for example, our mode icon, it's going to call our Git branch function, it's going to call our file type and our file size. And by doing that, it's going to give us a really, really nice status line. The last thing you got to do is just call that. So let's go and let's write, and then let's restart, and we'll go to our file, and we can see down the bottom that we've got this much nicer status line. So if I go to the bottom where we were, and I can go into insert mode, it's going to give us an icon, tell us that we're in insert mode. We know that we're in a Lua file. We know this Lua file is about 8 kilobytes. This is a Git repository. We know which branch that we're on. And finally, we know the path of this file. So this is, we've just built it ourselves. We still haven't introduced any dependencies, and it's already starting to look super usable. Now, the next section is going to be keymaps. I use the space for my leader and my local leader. Now, some people might find that this conflicts, so obviously use the approach that you want. And for those noobs out there, the leader is just the main key that we press before we hit some other key to make a sequence. And so we're going to reference that leader in all of these keymaps or these key shortcuts. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to set better movement in wrapped text. Because I use NeoVim to write notes and to draft YouTube scripts and that kind of thing, I have a lot of text. On the right hand side here, I've got some text. Now, when you're working with text in NeoVim, the default behavior is kind of annoying, because see here when I've got all this text wrapped. So if I set this to its default, so by default it's not wrapped, but because it's text, I wanted to wrap it. And now when I hit here, it actually just takes me to the next block of text. It doesn't actually take me line by line. See, this is actually line 3 and this is 4, but because it's wrapped, it's actually, from our user standpoint, that's not really the line. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply this, and this is the same thing as saying GJ, GJ, GJ. So when you prefix something with G, it's actually just going to go to the next line rather than shifting all the way to the end of that block. All right, so that's the first setting. Next, we've got setting for when we've gone and done a search. I want to hit leader C, so space C in my case, to clear the search highlight. So at the moment we've got keymap, right? And I'm going to hit that, and now keymap's no longer highlighted. I also want the next item to be in the middle. So when I hit N, I want it to be in the middle of the screen. So ZZ is to center something. And so when I search, let's say we go to opt, okay, now we're at the top here, but for example, it's always going to keep us in the very middle. Same thing when we do Control D for down and Control U for up. I want us to always be in the center, just so we can keep our eyes in the center of the screen. We're not moving around looking for stuff too much. Next is leader P. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste without yanking what I've selected. And the same thing goes for deleting without yanking. And this is going to be cool later because we're going to highlight the text on yank. Once again, not using a plugin, but the cool thing is that what we're doing is we're going to highlight, and I'll be able to demonstrate this. We've got two here for the next and the previous buffer. So leader BN for next, BP for previous. And then when we've got a bunch of windows, then we can simply move between them and so forth. So just then I'm going to go to BN, and that's going to take us through all of our buffers, and we're back in that text. Okay, so when we split, I'm going to use leader SV and leader SH to split vertically and horizontally. And we can also resize. So if we went here, then we can simply hold Control, and if we had vertical, now, one cool thing, I do like to rag on VS Code a lot, but for example, one thing I liked was if you hit Alt, then you can shift this line around. And that's what this section does. I can also select all of these and shift them all up or shift them all down. That's a nice, useful thing. And then if we select something, the behavior we want is like shown because I've already restarted. But if we didn't have this set up, what would happen is we would indent, and then it would be deselected. We'd have to select again, indent, and so forth. It just keeps that selection so that you can continuously indent or bring it back towards the left-hand column. One other thing, if sometimes we might use capital J. Now, capital J, it just keeps the cursor position. So for example, if I say J, it's just going to put it on the one line, but keep our cursor position. Then I have a function here, which is going to copy the full path. So for example, I want to see it. And just then I just did leader PA, and then it pasted it. And now I can also paste it here. Not that that is all that interesting, but a lot of the time when you need to know the path of the file or whatever, maybe a colleague is asking where's the location, you can just quickly grab it. And sometimes when you're writing or you're coding, you don't want the diagnostics to be enabled, and so I'm going to set leader TD to disable or enable the diagnostics. That's going to make more sense later when we get to the section on diagnostics. Okay, in the next section, we're going to be talking about autocommands. Autocommands are just triggered on a certain event, and then they run a certain action. That could be formatting code, that could be applying options, whatever it is. And so here I've got a few. The first one I want to highlight is text yank post. So let me apply this one. I'm going to write and I'm going to restart. Okay, and so I've restarted, and what I want to do, I want to show you that now when I select all this and I yank it, we are going to have 6 lines yanked. And if you saw that just then, it visually flashed a slightly different color for a moment, just to indicate to us that that had been done. Now, I said that I was going to demonstrate how we can paste without yanking, or we can delete without yanking. Okay, so let's say I yank this highlighted yank text, okay? And I'm not going to include the comment, Shift Y, and now I'm going to go to the register, and we can see that this is the most recent one, right? So I don't want to override that. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to visually select this. Okay, and now I'm going to use, let's say we're going to delete, or we're going to paste. So we're going to say leader P. Okay, we replaced it, but let's see if we go to our register, we can see that we didn't yank that. So this is just demonstrating what we had earlier. The cool thing about this text yank post is that we just get a little bit of highlighting for the feedback. All right, then this section is all about returning us to the last cursor position. So I'm going to quit everything. And I'm going to go back. And as we saw just then, I ended up exactly where I was in the file before I left. So this just restores the last cursor position. There are some exceptions. For example, in diff mode, we don't really want that. Just to be aware, but ultimately the purpose of this is just to return us to the last position, the last time that we were in NeoVim in this file. Okay, now sometimes when I'm writing, I want, based on the file type of being a markdown or text or git command, I don't want to wrap the text. I do want a line break, and I also want spelling. So let's demonstrate this. I'm going to quit out. I'm going to go to the text, and here we can see that we've got spelling on, so it's giving us a lot of errors because there's obviously dummy text and it's wrapped. So the cool thing is that this was based on the file type, the MD, the markdown file type, and that is just kind of a quality of life thing when you're using NeoVim to write a lot as well. Okay, so until now we've been getting away with no plugins, and you've already got a pretty powerful configuration at this stage, but I guess I'm a little bit of there's still a little bit of the soy dev in me from my early days with Atom and VS Code. I like having the tree on the left-hand side, even though netrw, which is built in with NeoVim, is really capable, but I just like being able to see them all. I actually never use it because I use FCF Lua for a fuzzy finder, which we're going to get into later, but I still just have it. So this is going to be the first plugin that we're going to apply, and I'm going to obviously include more, but I just want to demonstrate. So here we're using the vim.pack and add command, and we're providing the GitHub URL. This is the documentation on the left-hand side, or nvim-tree. And I've created a custom function, and what this does is it actually calls pack add and then the name of our plugin, all right, or our package. So the first one up here, it actually adds it or installs the plugin using the full GitHub URL. And the second one adds it so that when it's loaded, depending on whether it's optional or not, we're assuming here that it's optional, then we can actually see it. So I'm going to restart. If you want to see where it installs these plugins to, you can actually echo and then ampersand and then pack path. Okay, and then here we can see that there's a bunch of stuff, but importantly, we've got the .local share nvim site. All right, let's go and have a look at that. So if you want to see where your packages are going to be installed, they're going to, by default, be under local share nvim site pack core and opt. And opt is for optional. So when you install a package, it's going to be in the optional directory. That's why we need to invoke pack add, because pack add actually loads that plugin. So let's open up NeoVim, and it's going to say the plugins, these plugins will be installed. Do you want to install them? So we've got nvim-tree, which we just added already. So I'm going to hit yes, it's going to install the plugins. Okay, it's installed. In order to use it, we're going to have to call setup on nvim-tree, and then we're going to have a key binding so that we can actually open it. So let's go back to our configuration. All right, so we're back here, and what we need to do is we need to, as I mentioned, we need to call setup, and we also need to have some key binds so that we can open our NeoVim tree or nvim tree. Okay, and so I'm going to be expanding on this plugin section, and so I'm going to put the configs under another header just so it's easier for you to navigate in GitHub later. But what we need to do is we got to require nvim tree, and we set it up. I've got some basic things here. I want to set the width, and then I also want the dot files to be shown. So dot files false, it doesn't filter them out. Okay, and then finally we're going to have leader E. That's going to be E for Explorer. I'm going to write this file, and I'm going to restart, go to my file, and now when I hit E, we can see that we're in the Explorer. Okay, and just while we're here, I'm going to just show you an interesting thing. If we have a look at the nvim pack lock, if you're familiar with Lazy, this is keeping the version for you and it's recording the plugins that we've installed. All right, so noting that we've got our nvim-tree set up and working, let's get on to the next plugin. All right, so the next one is going to be FCF Lua, which is a fuzzy finder. And we're going to be using this fuzzy finder. I use it a lot in my projects. So the docs are on the left, the GitHub, and in here, I'm just adding it once again, vim.pack add, and then I'm calling it down here. So this is going to install it. This is going to invoke it. And then we've got to give it some setup options. So for example, I'm going to set it up, and then I've got some key maps here. So for example, leader FF is going to be to find files, FG is to grep, and then we've got FB to look at the buffers that we can shift to quickly. FH is to look at the help tags. FX is to look at the diagnostics in the document. And X is for the diagnostics in the workplace. So of course, there's plenty more stuff. You can check out the documentation. This is just the stuff that I use. Optionally, you can use web dev icons. But because, like I said, I'm going for a minimal configuration, which is 10 plugins or less, I'm actually not going to be including the web dev icons, but that's totally up to you. So I'm going to exit out. It's going to ask us to install. We're going to confirm. Okay, and so now if we wanted to, we can say use leader FG to grep, and I'm going to say vim.opt, and we can see all of the options. And of course, at the moment, this is a super small project. It's just in the one file. We could have just used search to do the same thing. But when you're in a massive code base, this is pretty handy. All right, so the next one is kind of a cheat code, because mini.nvim is indeed actually a library of 40 plus independent Lua modules. So it improves NeoVim's experience massively. So even though we're only going to have 10 plugins, there's all these mini plugins that I'm going to use here, and it'll make sense in a moment. So once again, we're adding it here to install it, and then we're calling it with the pack add to load it when we open NeoVim. And down here, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to paste in the require. So just a quick kind of look at these. AI is not artificial intelligence, but it around inside. So this is going to be good for visually selecting or looking at the different objects that we are able to navigate through. And in a moment, we're going to install Treesitter, which is going to give us highlighting and better control and navigation around these text objects. Comment is obviously for commenting. So you can simply hit GCC and we've got better comments. Move, surround, cursor word. I would kind of encourage you to check these all out in your own time. The indent scope, it's going to show you where there's trailing space, the indentation, the pairs to highlight the pairs, notify, and also icons. So it's got a mini icon set. So I'm going to exit out. I'm going to install, and it looks like I actually made a mistake when I was adding it up here. It's not mini-nvim, it's just mini.nvim. So let's try that again. So we can see it's been loaded and we've got the trailing space. If we did this here, we can see it's not immediately apparent, but we've got some nice things like this is just junk code obviously, but this is giving us nice indentation. These lines are indicating where everything is. At the end here, if I did that, I get red to indicate this is trailing white space. So this is all stuff which mini.nvim has added, and please do go and check the mini.nvim library. Like it says, there's more than 40 of these, so there might be more that you like the look of and that you might leverage. It even has its own status bar, for example, even though we've created our own, and it has a completion engine, even though I'm going to be using Blink for the completion, but we'll get to that. Okay, the next thing is going to be Git signs. This is a plugin which speaks for itself. It's Git integration for our buffers, and it's going to give us nice navigation to our different hunks, and it's also going to give us visual feedback on the changes and the deletions and the additions in our code. When it comes to opening files, we can immediately grasp what's changed and we can navigate to that. If I had to choose one Git plugin, then I'm going to choose this one, although Git Fugitive is a fabulous plugin, but like I said, I'm down to 10. I just want to choose the 10 which are really, really good for me, and these are the ones that I've chosen. So we're installing it up here, now we're adding it, git signs.nvim. And then down here, I've got a lot of different settings. So I'm going to set it up. I'm going to add some signs. So an addition is a narrow line, change is a thicker line, deletion is a small circle, top delete is a small circle, change delete is a larger circle, and untracked is just an empty circle. You can choose whatever kind of icons that you want, but I've got a few shortcuts here. So for example, we go to the next hunk, the previous hunk, and we can reset them. Okay, and so once we've got get signs set up, let's close everything. I'm gonna go back in. It's gonna ask us to install. Okay, and we can see that we've got some changes here. We've got some deletions, we've got some additions, and so forth. Okay, and so if I want to go to the next hunk, I can simply say close square bracket H, and it's going to take me to the next thing. I could preview it with leader HP, and we can see what's changed. All right, pretty powerful in your own time. Go and have a look at the documentation for get signs here on the left. Okay, the next plugin, and an important plugin, is going to be nvim Treesitter. So Treesitter is the configuration, the abstraction, and the passes so that NeoVim properly understands your code. It's not just text. It can understand that things are certain objects. It understands declarations of objects, functions, and the shape of the code that we're seeing on the screen. So it helps us to navigate, it helps it on the highlighting, and it helps us on the formatting and everything. So it's a very critical plugin, and we're going to install it here. Now, one of the things about it is that recently the API changed, and so I'm using the new main branch. When I say recently, it was probably about a year ago now, but a lot of people haven't got around to it. And if you go to their website, you can see that it has caution. It says that this is an incompatible rewrite on the main branch, but if you want, you can still use the master one. So if you want, you can go ahead and use the master one, but in this one, I'm actually using the updated one. It requires NeoVim 11 or later. Of course, we've got that. And here it has the installation instructions, and we're going to install it here. And then once again, we're going to load it here. Now, I've actually got a function that I've written for Treesitter, and I've got a bunch of different passes. The passes being the way that NeoVim or Treesitter installs these passes so that the files, whether they're Vim or Rust or C or JavaScript or whatever, these are the ones that I want to be installed. The old syntax used to have an ensure installed option. It doesn't have it anymore. And so what I've done is I've created this here in order to emulate the old behavior. Basically, we're going to require Treesitter, and then I've got a list of all these. We're going to set up Treesitter, and then I've got a list here of all of the functions that I mainly use. You can add in more, you can remove some if you want. Then we're going to get the config. We're going to find out which of these passes, these language passes, already installed. And then if any of them haven't been installed, then we want to install them, okay? And then finally, if we have a look in here, we're going to, based on the certain file type, we're going to load that parser. The last thing that we want to do is just call this function that I've declared above, all right? Let's exit out. It's going to ask us to install. Okay, and so now we've got this ts command, all right? And we can say ts install, and we can also manually do it. So when you come in here, if you add any languages or you remove any languages, then you're going to find that they automatically get downloaded, assuming that they're in that ensure installed list. Treesitter is going to become more apparent later, and it's helpful, you know, earlier when we looked at the options, for example, if you didn't really want to see this, or what we can say in NeoVim is ZC or ZC, and that's going to close that, and ZO, that opens it back up. And so I can open and close these different groups, and Treesitter helps NeoVim to understand the syntax. All right. In this next section, we're going to cover language server protocols. No good NeoVim setup, no modern coding configuration setup is complete without language server protocols. So we're going to be leveraging nvim lspconfig. Basically, this has out-of-the-box sensible configurations for many LSPs, and I'm going to teach you how to set it up for Python and Lua and TypeScript, and also C. I feel like every single configuration should have C in it, and also Golang. But the point is that you're going to be able to set it up for more, and once you understand the pattern of what I impart here and how to set up your own language servers and also your linters and formatters, from that point on, you will be able to configure it to your personal liking. So nvim lspconfig, that is one of the plugins that we need to add. And also we're going to add in Mason. So here we've got nvim lspconfig, and then Mason, what it is, it's a package manager that runs or allows you to install your language server protocols, your debug adapter protocols, linters and formatters. And we're going to be using this to install the language servers for those languages that I just listed. In here under vim.pack add, I've added the section for language server protocols or LSPs, and down here I'm going to also include them here under pack add, because as we know we need to load them. Now I'm going to move down here to the LSP section. The first thing that I want to do is I want to use the native Vim API, the diagnostics, just to set some better error or warning or hint or information or info signs. So I've added that here, and all this section of the code does is it just applies these nice icons up here. Of course you can edit those to your liking. And so when we get diagnostics, which is when we think about the benefits of the language server, we're getting definitions, diagnostics, we're getting a lot of stuff. And so these diagnostic signs are important just to show better feedback from the LSP. Now, in this next section, I've got an LSP on attach function. So what does this do? Well, we can map based on the client that we're using. So for example, we might be using Lua language server, or we might be using TypeScript language server, whatever it is, we can map certain shortcuts. So for example, I've got a bunch here, and some of these leverage FCF Lua that we installed earlier. So there's some basics like leader G and then capital D, that means go to the definition. Leader G and then S, that means go to the definition in a split on the side. I use vertical split by default. We can invoke code actions, we can rename things, we can open up the diagnostics for the line or under the cursor. We can go to the next or the previous diagnostic, we can hover on the definition, and we can also invoke a bunch of stuff here. So for example, this one, leader FD shows all of the file definitions, and then leader FR is all the references, and we've got type definitions, document symbols for all the symbols, function declarations and that kind of thing, workplace symbols, LSP implementations. So the last section under the on attach is if our language server client supports organize imports. So for example, Python or whatever, we want to organize our imports at the top of our file, then leader OI will allow us to organize those imports. Down here, we've got another auto command. I'm not going to put this under the auto command section because I think that it is so pertinent to this section. I don't want to confuse things. And so just under the on attach function, when there's an LSP attach event, then we want to add this LSP on attach function here, which we just declared and we just had a look at. We want to add that to the callback so that this gets attached. Anytime a language server is attached, we're going to have all of those shortcuts available. Few more keymaps that I'm going to set. For example, leader Q, that is going to open up the diagnostics list, and then leader DL is going to open up the line diagnostics. Okay, that's all well and good. We've added Mason above, right? Now, the last thing that we need to do is we actually need to call vim lspconfig. And so these are the language servers that I'm going to set up here with Lua ls, Pyrite for Python, Bash ls for obviously Bash shell scripting, TSLS for the TypeScript language server, Go PLS, and CLangD. So we need to make sure that we've installed all of these language servers. And we do that using Mason that we just looked at. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to exit out. When we come back in, it's going to ask us if we want to install those plugins. We're going to go ahead and say yes. Okay, and so once they've installed, come back in and just make sure that you also, just under where we were doing the git signs or wherever is appropriate for you, we need to require Mason because we've installed it, but we need to make sure that it's available for us to use. And therefore, I'm going to go and now I'm going to invoke Mason. And what's going to happen here, it's going to go and look up a list of all the language servers, linters, and formatters. And we're starting with the LSPs. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to use / and I'm going to search for Lua and Lua language server. And then once I've found it, I'm just going to hit I. And what that's going to do is that's going to install it. So we can see it's installing. Okay, and so Lua's been installed. And now let's go into Pyrite. And then I'm going to install the TypeScript language server, CLang, the Bash language server, and finally Go PLS for the Go language server. Okay, so just make sure that they're all installed. Okay, so we've installed those language servers, but language servers are well complemented by linters and formatters. And for linting and formatting, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be using a thing called efm-langserver. So EFM is what we call a general purpose language server. So we can plug in all of our linters and formatters into this general purpose language server, and it's going to give us the ability to lint and format the code. Now it's got out of the box plugins, and so the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to add this plugin, which is efm lspconfig's nvim. Okay, and so I've added the URL here to install, and under pack add, we're just going to say pack add efm lspconfig's nvim. Okay, and now down the bottom where we were setting up our language servers, we're going to use, in the case, for example, of Lua, we're going to have Lua check for our linting and star Lua for the formatting. For Python, we're going to have flake8 and black. So black is the formatter, flake8 is the linter. And then we're going to use Prettier. Prettier is pretty powerful. You can apply it for not just JavaScript, but also CSS and JSON and stuff like that. So I'm actually going to include it there. ESLint as well. Then we got Prettier. Prettier is applicable to many different types of web languages, so I'm going to include that as the formatter. And then ESLint is also pretty adaptive. I'm going to put that on for the linters. We're going to apply each of these in a moment. JSON, we're going to have a formatter, fixed JSON, and then for our bash, we're going to have shell check for the linter and FMT for the formatter. And then for C and C-like languages, we're going to be using CPP lint, C++ lint, and then CLang format for the formatter. So I've got all of these languages here, or these file types, and underneath this, so you got to stipulate to the EFM language server, these are the file types that we want to have linting and formatting for, and then you need to pass in what are the specific formatters and linters for each. So for example, C, we've got CLang format. Same thing for C++, all right? CSS, we're going to use Prettier, and same with HTML, and then JavaScript, React, TypeScript, React. They're all going to leverage ESLint and Prettier. The same thing goes for Vue, Lua, of course we're going to use Lua check, and Python, we're going to have flake8 and black. So before we can do anything here though, we need to, firstly, we're going to enable the EFM language server, because this is the general language server that we're using here. And on top of that, we need to install all of these formatters and linters. So let's go and do that. We can use Mason once again, and we can go over to linters, and let's just go and install them. So we've got flake8, Lua check, and in the case of Lua check, it's saying that we don't have Lua rocks in our path. So let's exit out. Okay, so I'm on an Arch system, right? So I'm going to be installing Lua rocks just using pacman. All right, once it's installed, let's go back into our config. We can install the efm lspconfigs, and let's return to Mason. And under the linters, I'm going to look for Lua again. So we got Lua check. I'm going to install that. Now I'm going to look for bash using shell check. For C and C++ languages, I'm going to use CPP lint. I'm going to be using ESLint D for TypeScript, JavaScript, but also all the other languages that we talked about. Okay, and I just realized that I had neglected to include Go, which is one of the demonstration languages. So for the linter, we're going to use Go Revive, and for the formatter, we're going to use Go fumpt. So let's go and install first the linter. Okay, and so we've got these linters now installed, and let's go and install the required formatters. So in the case of Python, I was using black. In the case of Lua, I was using style Lua. In the case of Go, I'm using Go fumpt. In the case of shell, I'm using sh fmt, JSON fix JSON. Finally, prettier D. All right, so once you've got all of these formatters and linters, and this is obviously, if you were using another language, this is a good point where you can kind of understand the pattern here, and you can go ahead and install any of the languages that you want here, okay? And so for example, if you were using Ruby, then you could come down and install the Ruby formatter, and the same thing goes for the language server and the linter. Okay team, we're getting pretty close here, and so the last thing that we need to do before we can test all of these linters and formatters, recall earlier that we set EFM here to enable. Now, what we need to do, this is the last time we need to open up Mason, and under our LSPs, we also need to install EFM. EFM doesn't have any keywords, but that's the general purpose language server. I'm going to install it. Now, in order to get it to work, you will need to have Go installed on your system, so just make sure that you do that. Okay, and now what I'm going to do, I'm going to write and close. We just installed EFM. I'm going to open up my init.lua, and in here we're going to start to see some Lua check feedback, and specifically what it's saying is that we've got this global variable vim. Lua check doesn't know what it is, and we're mutating it. So what we need to do, I'm going to open up the file explorer, and in here I've got a Lua check RC. I'm going to hit R, and I'm going to change that to activate it. I previously prefixed it with back just so it wasn't on. All this has is a global vim, and I'm going to do the same thing in this Lua rc.json. These are the Lua language server settings. So we see here we've got another diagnostics globals, and that's vim. So now let's go back to our init, and we're going to restart. Okay, and so I'm back in, and we've got those settings for the global vim, and that means it's not giving us any warnings. But if I say leader nd, we can see here, and I'm going to set wrap just so that we can see this entire line. We can see that LuaCheck is giving us feedback on this because this line is too long. It's more than 120 characters, which must be the default in LuaCheck. And just for some basic checks, for example, if I make it so the syntax isn't valid, it's going to say that we're missing a symbol. So I'm going to put that symbol back. Finally, if we go to our Autocommands, I've added a format on save. So for example, before we write to the buffer on this hook, which is buff write pre, so right before we write to the buffer, any of these files with a suffix listed here, we're going to check if there is a client, an EFM client attached, and we're going to use EFM to format the file. So let's just say that I go in here and I mess around with some of the formatting. When I write, it's going to format. Okay, we're getting pretty close, but the thing is, the last thing that I want to do is I want to introduce blink.cmp. Okay, so blink.cmp is a performant batteries included completion plugin for NeoVim. What does that mean? It is going to help us to reference our language servers, our buffers, our path, and also a snippet engine to get those VS Code like snippets. So this is called luasnip, and this has got a bunch of snippets written in Lua, available for NeoVim. And so we're going to be having completion, because obviously that's one of the most powerful things that we would have in any kind of modern editing environment. In here, I've added blink.cmp, which are obviously the URL. I needed to add the version, and then down below that I've also added luasnip. So we're going to install those, and then make sure that once you've installed, you also are going to be calling pack add. Now let's go and have a look at Blink's setup. Blink, I'm going to put it under the same section with respect to our LSP. So let's say this is LSP. It's not really just LSP anymore, but we're going to say it's linting, formatting, and completion. Okay, so just walking through the setup though, we've got some keymaps. So basically we've got control and space to show or hide the completion options. And then we also have enter to accept. So carriage return stands for enter here. Control J and K just means that we can go to the next or the previous completion option that's being presented to us, and tab and shift tab to look at the next or the previous snippet. Now, this important part here is that we've got some sources. As I mentioned, one of the most powerful things about language server protocols is that we can use them for the definitions and also to look at the function signatures and look at the completion options. We've got the path that just refers to where we are relative to other files, and our buffer, so all of our open buffers, it's going to be able to have a look at that, see any of the symbols that are attached and that kind of thing. And finally, snippets. So as I mentioned a moment ago, we're going to be using luasnip, and luasnip is this plugin engine written for NeoVim. So we're going to tell Blink, our completion plugin, please use luasnip, which is installed. Now, it has fuzzy finding capabilities, and in order to get that working, I had to set download to true on the pre-built binaries. Finally, once we've got Blink completely set up, we want to say on the lspconfig for every single one of these language servers. So you see down below we've got Lua, Pyrite, all those ones that we've been working on. Well, we want to say please attach the completion capabilities to all of the language servers so that we get, even if we don't have a language server installed, we would still get some capabilities. You can imagine things like the buffer and the path and that kind of thing. Excellent. So we are set up, and now we're ready to demonstrate what this looks like. Okay, so now I've got a very simple Python file. It's just got this test function, and I just want to demonstrate some of the aspects. So for example, let's say I wanted to import. Well, we can say s, and we see everything that we can import now with our completion. And if we come down here, we can say sys, and maybe we want to see if there's anything with version. There's version info. All right, okay, it's actually not callable. It's telling us the LSP is giving us that information. Flake 8, the linter, is telling us, okay, it requires or expects 2 lines. We didn't actually have to do that manually because we can write, and that's going to auto format. Pretty good. So this is set up for all those languages that we discussed. Now in this section, we're getting close to the end. Let's say we want to use a terminal. Well, what we could do in NeoVim is we could do Control Z, that puts it into the background, and then we could bring it to the foreground with FG. However, what I've got here is I've got a floating terminal. So basically what we're going to be doing is setting up a few Autocommands so that we create a buffer for the terminal. And we want to do things like we want to turn off the numbers, the relative numbers, and we don't want a sign column when we've got a terminal open. And this is a function which creates the floating terminal. So for example, it puts it on 80% of the height and 80% of the width, and it's got a few styling components and a few highlight components. And so basically this section, all it's doing is it's just setting up a floating terminal. This is totally up to you. You can use plugins, but we've actually hit our maximum of 10 plugins now. Now, if we wanted to invoke this, we can use leader T, or we can hit escape to close it. So let's restart. And so now what I'm going to do, I'm going to hit leader T, and we've got a terminal. Let's see, print working directory, we've got that. If we hit escape, it goes away. If we hit it again, it's back and it persists. Okay, so right at the beginning, we set our theme, and the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to include this set transparency function. So all this does is it gets all the elements and it makes them transparent, because I think that's a nice thing in your configuration to have transparency. And under our nvim-tree, I'm also going to apply these options just to make sure that it's fully transparent. So let's restart. And you're going to see that it's actually not transparent yet, and that's because my terminal emulator, I'm using Kitty, and it itself is not transparent. So go to your respective terminal emulator. I'm going to go into here, and I'm going to change the background opacity to 0.8. And now we can see that we've got transparency, and our configuration is complete. Okay, and just to wrap up, I wanted to touch on some honorable mentions of other plugins that I've used, because we've limited ourselves to 10, but you can actually add in more, and you know, these are excellent plugins that I've used in the past myself. So for example, Codium by Windsurf is a great AI completion plugin. We also have LSP Saga. What this one does is it makes your LSP experience even nicer with better UI and nice shortcuts. Lualine, now we built our own status line, but you can use Lualine if you'd like. It's a really great status line. NVim DAP UI is for the debugger adapter protocol. Now we didn't use that in this configuration, and frankly I don't really use the debugger that much, but this is an excellent plugin if you'd like to use that. Rustation is for Rust, and it's a supercharged Rust experience for NeoVim. If you do code in Rust, then I'd highly recommend this rather than going through the path that we went today. This plugin takes care of all the LSP, the linting, the formatting, and so forth. Trouble NVim is a diagnostics plugin. It's excellent for workplace diagnostics and getting a feel for the references and telescope results, quick fix, and that kind of thing. Vim Fugitive, it's a Git wrapper. I use the terminal most of the time to do my Git work, and so I didn't include this plugin, but if you want to have a great Git wrapper, this is the one. Now, especially for newcomers, when you get into NeoVim, some of the keybinds, they don't really stick. So which key, it basically just gives you hit the leader key, space, in our configuration today, and then it tells you all of the associated keybinds that you can use. So this is great for learning your keybinds and understanding what keybinds are available. Finally, if you do a lot of writing or coding, you want distraction free, then I think Zen Mode is an excellent plugin, and I use this one a lot myself. It basically just simplifies the whole UI. It cleans everything up. It's a really nice plugin. Well, congratulations. You've come this far. You've got your own custom NeoVim configuration in less than 1,000 lines. You've got 10 plugins which you can build on because you know enough about the built-in plugin manager to be dangerous, and you're becoming a little bit of a Vim connoisseur. So if you enjoyed this video, if you'd like to see more videos like this, please do subscribe. It means a lot that you joined today, and I hope to see you in the next one. Thank you.